The big dining room of the White family mansion smelled like fresh flowers and lemon polish. The tall windows let in bright morning light that made the gold edges of the furniture shine. 8-year-old Lucas sat at the long table, his legs swinging. Under the chair, he wore the blue shirt his father liked him to wear when important people came. But today felt different. Something in the air made his small hands grip the edge of his seat. At the head of the table sat Mr. Edward White, one of the richest men in the state. His silver hair was neat, and his suit looked like it cost more than most people's cars. His voice was deep when he finally spoke. "Lucas," he said, "today you will choose a new mother." Lucas blinked and stared at him. "A new mother?" His voice came out small. Edward nodded, his face serious. "It's been 3 years since your mother passed. You need a mother to guide you, and I need a wife who will fit our life. I've invited 5 fine women. All of them are from good families, well-educated, and wealthy. You will meet each one, and then you will choose." Lucas's heart beat faster. His small mind didn't know how to answer. His real mother had been warm, soft-spoken, and she had always bent down to hug him tight. He couldn't imagine someone else taking her place. But he knew when his father spoke like this, he meant business. Lucas looked down at his plate. Toast, eggs, strawberries. He didn't feel like eating. The tall double doors opened, and the first woman walked in. She wore a bright red dress, shiny high heels, and perfume so strong that Lucas felt it in his nose. She smiled, showing perfect teeth, and kissed Edward on the cheek. "This is Mrs. Vivian Kane," Edward said. Vivian looked at Lucas and tilted her head. "Oh, what a handsome boy. Do you like yachts, dear?" Lucas shrugged. He didn't even know if he liked boats. She talked a lot about fancy trips and jewelry, but she didn't ask him anything else. When she left, Lucas felt tired from just listening. The next woman came in wearing a fur coat even though it was warm outside. She patted Lucas's head like he was a dog and told Edward how many famous people she knew. The third one barely looked at Lucas at all, keeping her eyes on Edward as if the boy wasn't even there. The fourth one asked him if he liked boarding school. "What's that?" he asked. She just laughed and said, "You'll find out." The fifth woman was young and beautiful, but she kept checking her phone the whole time, her fingers moving fast on the screen. By the end of the last visit, Lucas felt like the room had grown heavier. His father looked proud of the women's fine clothes and sharp words. But Lucas's mind wandered to the kitchen, where Grace would be washing dishes and humming her favorite gospel songs. Grace had been the housekeeper since before Lucas was born. She was tall and strong, with warm brown skin and a smile that made him feel safe. She didn't wear perfume, only the soft scent of clean laundry and fresh bread. She wasn't rich, but she always found ways to make his world brighter. When he had bad dreams, she brought warm milk. When he scraped his knee, she cleaned it gently and said, "Every scar has a story, little man." She listened, really listened, to the things he said, and she had a laugh that filled the whole kitchen like sunshine. Lucas didn't understand all the things adults cared about: money, names, power, but he knew one thing. None of the women he met today had looked at him the way Grace did. Edward cleared his throat and looked at his son. "So, Lucas, have you decided? Which lady will be your new mother?" The big room fell quiet. The house staff stood in the corners, still as statues. The 5 rich women waited in the hall, expecting to be called. Lucas took a deep breath, his small voice steady but clear. "I choose Grace." For a moment, it felt like the whole house stopped breathing. Edward's eyes narrowed, and he sat back slowly. "Grace?" he repeated, as if the name tasted strange on his tongue. Somewhere in the hallway, one of the women let out a small gasp. "She's not even on the list," Edward said firmly. Lucas looked his father right in the eyes. "She's on my list." The sound in the dining room changed. It was as if the air grew heavier, pressing down on every shoulder. Edward's hand tightened around the silver fork, his knuckles turning white. "Lucas, you don't understand what you're saying," he said slowly, his voice low but sharp like a blade. "A mother is not just someone who makes you cookies or tucks you in at night. She must fit into our world. She must have class, wealth, and status. Grace is the help." The last word came out like something bitter. Lucas sat straighter, his small chin lifting. "She's more than that to me," he said, his voice trembling but sure. In the hallway, the women had begun whispering, their voices like snakes sliding across the floor. One laughed under her breath, another muttered, "Absurd." Edward stood, the tall back of his chair scraping against the floor. "This conversation is over," he announced. "You will choose from the women I brought here today." But Lucas didn't move. His mind was full of memories, Grace sitting beside his bed when he had a fever. Grace walking through the rain to bring him his favorite toy from the car. Grace clapping for him when he learned to ride his bike even though no one else was watching. She was the one who told him that kindness was the richest thing you could own. He couldn't let that go. "Then I choose no one," he said, his small voice cutting through the room. The staff's eyes widened, Edward's face darkened. Before he could speak again, the kitchen door swung open, and there stood Grace herself, holding a tray of fresh bread. She froze when she saw every eye turn to her. "What's going on?" she asked slowly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes searched Lucas's face. Edward's tone was icy. "My son has decided to embarrass us all by making a joke. He says you should be his new mother." Grace's eyes widened, and the tray trembled slightly in her hands. "Mr. White, she began, but Lucas jumped down from his chair and ran to her side. He grabbed her hand, looking up at her with all the stubbornness an 8-year-old could have. "It's not a joke," he said. "I mean it." Grace looked down at him, and in her dark eyes he saw both surprise and something else, fear. She had worked here for years. She had kept her life simple, careful, never stepping outside the lines of her job. Now with one sentence, Lucas had drawn her into the center of a storm she didn't ask for. Edward stepped forward, his voice now booming. "Grace, this is ridiculous. You and I both know our lives are not meant to mix in that way." He waved a hand toward the hall where the rich women waited. "These are women who can help raise my son with the connections, the knowledge, and the refinement he needs to inherit my empire." Grace's voice was quiet but steady. "Sir, with respect, an empire means nothing if the boy's heart is empty." The words hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. Edward's mouth opened, then shut. Lucas squeezed Grace's hand tighter, as if afraid someone would pull her away. One of the women in the hall finally stepped into the room, her red dress blazing like fire. "Edward, really," she said with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "This is charming, but perhaps the boy should play in the garden while we discuss adults' business." Lucas's face turned red, his small fists clenching. "I'm not a baby," he shot back. "And I know who cares about me for real." The woman blinked at him, clearly not used to being talked to like that. Edward took a long, slow breath, then turned to his son. "Fine," he said coldly. "You want to make this choice? Then you'll prove it. I will give Grace a trial, 30 days. In that time, she will act as your mother in this house. If after 30 days, I see she is not fit, you will choose again my way." Lucas's heart leapt with hope, but Grace's heart sank with worry. She knew this was not just a trial, it was a test designed for her to fail. She had no gowns, no fine jewels, no perfect dinner party manners. She had only herself, her faith, and her love for this boy. Edward's eyes glinted as if he already knew the outcome. But Lucas only looked up at her with a smile, as if he had already won. The next morning, the mansion woke up early and nervous, like a drum before a parade. Sunlight spilled over the lawns, and the fountain in the courtyard sang its steady song. But everyone inside felt the clock begin to tick. Grace tied her hair back with a clean ribbon and wore a simple blue dress. She stood in the kitchen with her hands around a warm mug of tea, whispering a short prayer for strength. Lucas rushed in with messy hair and bright eyes and hugged her waist. "We'll do this together," he said. She smiled and touched his cheek. "Together," she agreed. When Edward walked in, he looked like a judge in a courtroom. "Schedule," he said, tapping the table. "Today there will be 3 tests. Breakfast manners, school meeting, and a charity lunch at the City Museum. I want to see if you can keep pace." Grace nodded once. She did not argue. She did not boast. She just said, "Yes, sir," with steady eyes. In the dining room, silverware sparkled and napkins were folded like crowns. A silent maid brought food, waiting for Grace to slip. Grace sat beside Lucas, guided him to sit straight, and showed him where the fork went and how to hold the spoon. She did it with soft words and a gentle smile. When Lucas forgot and reached for the jam with his fingers, she placed the small knife in his hand and whispered, "Careful, little man. The table is a stage, and you are the star." He grinned and did it right. Edward watched, expecting chaos. But he saw something else. He saw a boy who wanted to learn because he felt safe with his teacher Doc at the school meeting. The head of school had sharp glasses and a sharper mouth. "We expect fine character, fine grades, and fine families," she said, looking at Grace like she was a smudge on a window. Grace did not flinch. She rested her hand on Lucas's shoulder. "This boy is brave and curious," she said. "He reads past bedtime and asks why the stars are so many. He shares his toys with the gardener's son. He will be fine in your school because he knows how to be kind, and kindness is the start of every great mind." The head of school blinked as if the words pushed her back an inch. When she tried to test Lucas, asking him math and spelling and a riddle about a bridge, Lucas answered with his small clear voice and even smiled at the riddle. The head of school nodded at last, surprised. She stamped the paper with a satisfied thud, and Lucas beamed up at Grace. The charity lunch came next, and it was a room full of shiny plates, whispering people, and paintings that looked like they could float off the walls. The 5 rich women were there, like bright birds on a long branch. Vivian in red, the one with the fur coat now wearing pearls, the one who never looked at Lucas, the boarding school lady, and the young one always tapping her phone. They watched Grace walk in, holding Lucas's hand. Some smiled too wide, some didn't smile at all. "Oh, Grace, what a lovely dress," Vivian said in a voice that sounded like honey over ice. "Did you sew it yourself?" Lucas frowned at the question, but Grace kept her smile calm. "Thank you," she said simply, and she guided Lucas to the table. When speeches started, the museum director asked donors to share why art mattered. Edward looked at Grace, waiting for her to get scared. But Grace stood and told a story about the first time she saw a painting of a mother holding a child. "I was a girl," she said. "We had no money for pictures at home. But I looked at that mother's hands and I felt the warmth of them, like sunlight on bread. That day I learned that art is a doorway. It lets your heart step into a bigger room." The crowd grew quiet. Some people clapped. Edward's eyes narrowed again, because he had wanted her to fail, and now he could not say that she had. Days moved like slow water, and each day brought a new test wrapped in a smile. The rich women began to visit the mansion with gifts and advice that felt like traps. The fur coat lady dropped off a list called "Rules for a Proper Wife," with lines about how to speak, how to walk, and how never to disagree with your husband in public. Grace read it, folded it, and used it as scratch paper to help Lucas practice spelling. The boarding school lady invited Lucas to visit a school where boys his age marched in lines and did not speak at lunch. Lucas came home with a stiff back and a sad face, and Grace took him to the backyard and taught him to fly a kite. "There are times to march," she said, laughing as the wind tugged the string. But joy is the wind that lifts you. The faithful young woman with the phone posted pictures online and wrote, "So proud to help a special family find their perfect future." That night, strangers left rude comments about Grace, guessing her story, guessing her worth. Edward showed the post to Grace across his big desk, as if he were a weatherman predicting storms. "The world watches," he said. "Can you stand it?" Grace's fingers curled, but her voice stayed even. "I have stood through real storms," she said. "Rain on a broken roof, hunger on a Sunday night, a plane ride to a new country with only one bag and one prayer. I will stand through this too." Edward looked away first, and outside his window a bird rose off the fountain and cut a clean line across the sky, but the hardest traps were the soft ones. One afternoon, Vivian arrived with a pastry box and a friendly smile. "I brought your favorite," she told Edward, and he gave her that slow half-smile that meant he felt seen. She pulled Grace aside. "Let me help," she said sweetly. "Wear my dress to Edward's investor dinner. You'll look more polished." Grace paused. The dress was beautiful and tiny, and nothing like her. But she thought of the dinner, of all the eyes that would stare at her, of the whispers that would rise if she came in her plain blue dress. She thought of Lucas, who would be sitting quiet and watchful. She nodded. "Thank you," she said. The night of the dinner, Grace put on the red dress and stood in the mirror. It fit, but it did not fit her soul. Lucas walked in, eyes wide. "You look like a rose," he whispered. "Do you like it?" she asked. He looked at her face, not the dress. "I like you," he said. "Don't let the dress take you away." She kissed his hair. "It won't," she promised. At the dinner, cameras flashed. Important people talked about money, markets, and maps with red pins. Grace smiled and listened, and made sure Lucas had water and a napkin, and a quiet joke when he looked bored. Then it happened. A woman accidentally brushed past and spilled a glass of red wine straight down the front of Grace's borrowed dress. A hush fell. Vivian's eyebrows flew up, her voice bright and loud. "Oh dear, so clumsy. There's a stain remover in the powder room, but such delicate fabric, it might be ruined." Grace looked down at the spreading stain and felt heat rise in her chest. She excused herself and went to the powder room. She stood at the sink with cold water rushing and folded paper towels in neat squares. She dabbed, heard laughter drift in from the hall, and then she looked at herself in the mirror. The red dress clung like someone else's story. She unzipped it, hung it gently, washed her face, and put on her plain blue dress she had carried in a bag. When she walked back in, there was a small stir. Vivian's mouth curled. "Oh," she said. "Back to your uniform?" Grace's voice did not shake. "Back to myself," she said. Edward, who had been about to step in with a cold defense, stopped and stared instead. He saw that she had chosen dignity over display, and though he said nothing, his eyes said he understood. Later that week, a bigger test came. The company faced a rumor that an old factory had caused harm years ago. Reporters circled like crows. Lawyers sharpened their words. Edward's board pressed him to speak fast and hard and to deny everything. "We will not be painted as villains," said a man with a shiny watch. "We don't apologize. We move on." Grace stood at the edge of the room with a tray of coffee, invisible to most of them as usual. But Lucas's eyes found her, and the way his small shoulders hunched made her step forward. "Mr. White," she said carefully, "may I say something?" The room froze. No one spoke to the board unless the board spoke to them. Edward almost said no on instinct, but then he remembered the museum story and the red dress in the mirror. He nodded once. Grace set down the tray. "I don't know your numbers," she said. "I don't know your charts. But I know what people hear. They hear if you are hiding. They hear if you are honest. When I first came to this house, The boy cried at night, and the floor was clean, and the dishes were perfect. And still the house was not right, because there was no truth in it, only silence. If something bad happened, tell it. If someone was hurt, see them and make them whole. If you do that, people will still judge you, but they will also trust you. You cannot buy trust with a press release. The shiny watchman snorted. Thank you for the housekeeping view, he said. We have experts. Edward looked at Grace, and without a word he knew she was telling him the thing no one else would say. He dismissed the room and called his lawyer. He chose to speak plain at the press conference the next day. He admitted there had been harm. He named the steps to fix it. He set up a fund to help the families. Reporters blinked. Some said he was foolish. Others said he was brave. Stocks dipped for 2 days, then rose higher than before. Inside the house, a new quiet settled, a clean quiet, not the old kind built from fear. The trial days kept sliding off the calendar, and each one left a mark. Some marks were soft, like the smell of cinnamon rolls on Saturday morning, when Grace let Lucas measure the sugar and spill a little and laugh a lot. Some marks were loud, like the thunderstorm that knocked out power at dinner time. In the dark, the mansion's fancy systems went quiet. Staff ran around with flashlights. Edward cursed softly into his phone. Lucas pressed close to Grace, and she guided him to the kitchen. We will eat by candlelight, she said. She placed 3 candles in a circle, warmed soup on the gas stove, sliced bread, and set the table like it was a holiday. Edward stalked in, angry and wet from checking the generator. He stopped at the door, surprised by the warm, flickering light and the smell of soup. Grace handed him a towel, and he took it without thinking. They sat, the 3 of them, with the storm growling outside like a big dog. Lucas broke his bread and dipped it in his soup and said, I like this. It feels like a campfire in the kitchen. Edward let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. We used to camp, he said quietly, staring at the flame. Before everything got bigger. Grace looked at him, her eyes soft. Bigger can be good, she said, if your heart grows with it. After dinner, the 3 of them played a word game that Lucas made up, and when the lights finally flicked back on, Edward surprised himself by wishing they would flicker off again. Not every moment was sweet. There were days when Edward snapped over small things, like a tie clip that went missing or a late car. There were mornings when rumors about Grace flared up online again, and a neighbor looked down her nose at her in the market. There was a Sunday when the church choir sang, and a woman whispered to another, She is reaching above her place. Grace heard the words as if they were stones thrown at her back, and for a moment, old shame rose like cold water. But then, she felt Lucas slip his small hand into hers and swing their arms, and she smiled back at him. We stand where love sets us, she said. She kept going. She made sure homework was done, and bedtime was peaceful, and that dreams were chased. And fears were named. She made sure Lucas said, thank you to the driver and please to the cook and good morning to the gardener. She made sure he could tie his shoes and also untie a knot in his heart by talking about it. She reminded him that money was a tool, not a master. Your father builds bridges made of deals, she told him. One day you will build bridges made of people. Both kinds matter, but the people bridges hold up the world. A new twist cut across the calm near the end of the month. The 5 rich women did not stop their plans. Vivian, who had friends at a glossy magazine, arranged a cover story titled, Can Love Cross This Line? The article carried photos of the mansion, a blurry shot of Grace leaving church with Lucas, and a long piece that guessed at her past and hinted that she wanted the billionaire's money. The story fell on the city like a sudden gust of wind, pushing people to talk louder. Edward slammed the magazine on his desk hard enough to make the pen cup jump. This is too far, he said, anger carving lines deep in his face. He called Vivian and told her never to set foot on his property again. She cried, then raged, then hung up. Reporters waited at the gate. Lucas came home from school with a red face. "A boy said you are a gold digger," he told Grace, shaking. "He said you tricked Dad. I pushed him. I'm sorry." Grace knelt, took his hands, and spoke in a low, steady voice. "Listen to me. You can't fight every lie with fists. You fight with a life that is true. You stand tall, you act right, you keep your joy. That is how you win." He swallowed and nodded. That night, Edward made a choice that surprised everyone, especially himself. He called a small, trusted reporter and invited him to dinner. No cameras, no flash. Just one notebook. He said he would tell the real story of this house for once, not the shiny version. They set the table with the simple dishes, not the heavy gold ones. Grace cooked comfort food: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with a little garlic, and she took off her apron and sat with them, because this was her story too. The reporter was quiet, the kind who listened more than he spoke. He asked about the 30-day trial, about the moment in the dining room, about the choice of a boy who had lost his mother. Edward talked about grief in a voice that felt like gravel under a river. He said he had tried to fill the space his wife left with more work and more walls. He said it never worked. Lucas talked about the nights when the house felt like a museum, clean and cold, and how Grace's laugh warmed the rooms. Grace talked about leaving home with a suitcase and a prayer, about taking the job at the mansion, about deciding to be a safe place for a small boy who didn't know he needed one. She did not talk about money. She did not talk about dresses. She talked about steady hands and honest words, and how love can be quiet and still be strong. When dessert came, warm apple pie, Edward took a breath and said something he had never said in public. "I thought status made a family," he said, looking not at the reporter but at Grace and Lucas. "Now I think service does. The person who serves love, serves truth, serves others, that is the heart of a house." The reporter wrote it down, closed his notebook, and did not take a photo. He said thank you and left. The story he wrote a few days later was not glossy. It was not loud. It was kind and clear. It did not name Grace a saint or Edward a hero. It said a boy made a choice because he knew who showed up for him. It said a man listened and changed. It said a woman stood steady while the world shook her branches and still her roots held. People read it and felt something open inside, like a window stuck shut for too long. The 30th day fell on Lucas's 9th birthday, and the house woke up with a quiet buzz. Balloons pressed against the ceiling. The kitchen smelled like chocolate. A small mountain of gifts waited in the corner, most of them wrapped by people who wanted to be seen on the right side of a story. Grace gave Lucas a small box with a ribbon. Inside lay a bracelet made of simple leather with a tiny silver bead. "This is a promise bead," she told him. "When you touch it, remember to keep your promises to yourself, to be brave and kind to others, to be honest and strong." Lucas hugged her so hard, the box fell to the floor with a soft thump. Edward came in with a long blue box and a soft look on his face. "A kite," he said, and Lucas laughed because he already knew. They took the kite to the lawn. The sky was clear, the wind sure. Grace and Edward stood side by side while Lucas ran, and the kite climbed and climbed until it pulled the string like a living thing. "He flies because we both hold the line," Grace said quietly. Edward nodded. "And because we let it out when it's time." At noon, family and staff gathered in the ballroom. Edward cleared his throat, and the room fell still. "Today our 30 days end," he said. "I gave this trial thinking it would fail." He looked at Grace, and his voice softened. "I was wrong." He turned to Lucas. "Son, I asked you to choose a new mother from 5 rich women. You chose someone rich in the things that matter. You chose the person who has mothered you from the heart for years. If you still choose Grace, I will honor it, not as a test, as truth." Lucas didn't hesitate. His small voice carried like a bell. I choose Grace. The room broke into applause that felt clean, not forced. Some eyes were wet. The 5 rich women were not there to see it. They had drifted away as the month showed them a mirror they did not like. Edward turned to Grace. Grace, I do not ask this lightly. Will you marry me not as a symbol or a rescue or a headline, but as a partner who has already taught me more than any boardroom ever did? The room held its breath. Grace looked at Lucas first, then at Edward. Her eyes were bright, and her smile was quiet. Yes, she said. Lucas whooped and jumped, and from the back of the room, the gardener clapped loud and started a cheer. Music rose, light and bright, and for a moment, the house felt weightless, like a kite tugging at its string in a kind wind. Happiness is not a shield. A week after the birthday, a new storm arrived, the kind that does not come from weather. Anne, old partner of Edward, a man named Cole with a smooth voice and sharp ties, began to spread poison in private rooms. He said the marriage was a trick to soften the public and hide a deal that would hurt workers. He said Edward was weak now, tied to a woman who knew nothing of high finance. He said Lucas would grow up soft. He gathered 3 board members to his side and called for a vote to remove Edward as CEO. The news reached the mansion like a sour smell. Edward slammed the door to his study so hard the paintings rattled. Lucas walked in an hour later and found him sitting with his head in his hands. Grace didn't go to the study. She went to the kitchen. She measured flour and sugar and cut cold butter into small cubes. She worked the dough until it was soft and ready. She put biscuits in the oven and washed her hands, and only then did she walk down the hall. She knocked and waited. Edward opened the door with a face that looked 10 years older. She held out a plate. Eat, she said. You think better when you are not starving. He almost laughed, and then he did laugh, a short, real sound. He ate a biscuit and then another, and the anger inside him settled into something harder and cleaner. He thinks I won't fight, Edward said. He thinks I'll play nice. Grace shook her head. Don't fight like him. Fight like you. Speak plain. Show the numbers. Bring the workers in. Let the truth in the room and watch the shadows run. The next day, Edward did something no one expected. He called an open meeting in the company's largest hall and invited not just board members but employees from every level: factory hands, truck drivers, designers, accountants. He stood on the stage with charts that were clear, not pretty. He explained the deal that Cole wanted, how it would raise profits fast and cut the legs off future work. He named the cost to families. He named alternatives. He asked for questions. The room filled with simple, hard questions that CEOs rarely hear because they rarely ask to hear them. Edward answered. Grace watched from the side with Lucas, and both of them saw it happen. Trust grew in that room like bread under a clean cloth. When the board met for the vote, 3 members who had leaned toward Cole shifted toward Edward. Cole spoke in long, fancy sentences. Edward spoke in short, true ones. The vote went Edward's way by 1 seat. In the parking lot afterward, a factory foreman shook Edward's hand with both of his. Haven't seen a boss do that in 20 years, he said. Edward looked at Grace and knew where his spine had been made stronger. On the day they signed their vows in a small garden behind the mansion, there were only a few guests: the gardener and his wife, the cook and her sister, the driver and his father, the head of school, the reporter who had listened, and 2 old friends of Edward who remembered the man he had been before the walls went up. Lucas stood in a small suit that made him look like a very serious sparrow. Grace wore a simple white dress with sleeves that moved like quiet water. The sky was friendly. The vows were short. Edward promised to lead with honesty and to listen even when listening hurt. Grace promised to bring truth to the table and to guard joy like a lamp in the wind. Lucas promised to say what he felt and to try to wash his cereal bowls without being told. They laughed, they cried, they ate lemon cake, and when the sun slid down the sky, music floated over the lawn. For the first dance, Edward held Grace like something he was grateful not to have dropped. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" she asked. "For opening a window in this house," he said. "And for teaching me that love is work, not a wish." She rested her head on his chest. "Then we will go to work," she said. "But life does not end at a wedding. It begins again." Grace started a program with the company to support workers, families, child care help, night classes, and a fund for hard times. She visited the factories and learned people's names and their stories. She turned some of her small recipes into a company cafe menu so that the food at work tasted like home. Lucas started a kindness club at school that sounded silly too. Some kids until the club fixed the garden by the flag and set up a lost and found system that actually worked. Edward moved his desk out of the high corner office and into a glass room on the floor where people could wave at him. The glossy magazines had to find a new story because this one got quiet, and quiet stories don't sell covers. Grace was fine with that. She liked quiet. It is where you hear the truth. One evening in late fall, when the air carried wood smoke and the first leaves scraped the stone paths, a letter came in a careful hand from far away. It was from Grace's mother, who had never left her village. She had borrowed a neighbor's help to write. The letter said she had heard many things, some kind, some cruel, and she wanted to know only one truth. "Are you happy, my daughter?" Grace sat with the letter in her lap and tears hot on her cheeks. She went to the kitchen. She made tea. She called her mother on a shaky line that put their voices through a tunnel. "Mama," she said, and felt 10 years old and 100 at the same time. "I am happy in the way that is work. I am tired and full and stretched and steady. I am loved. And I am loving a boy into a man and a man into a better man." The line crackled. Her mother laughed softly and said a blessing that wrapped around Grace like a shawl. Later that night, Lucas wandered in and found Grace looking at the moon. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About promises," she said. "About the ones we keep and the ones that keep us." He touched the silver bead on his bracelet. "I keep mine," he said. She kissed his forehead. "I know. People think the test is the 30 days, the vote, the wedding, the headline. But the real test is Tuesday night when homework is hard and the car won't start. It is the meeting that runs late and the dinner that burns and the apology you give before sleep so your heart can rest. It is the way you hold your ground kindly when someone calls you a name and the way you speak up gently when someone needs a hand." Grace kept passing that test in small ways that stacked up like bricks. Some weeks the old whispers came back, softer now, and died at the edge of the yard like tired birds. Some months new problems rose, a supply chain that broke, a teacher who didn't see Lucas clearly, a cousin of Edward who asked for money with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Grace answered each with the same tools: truth, patience, humor, and the calm that comes from knowing who you are. When Lucas asked big questions about the world, she didn't hurry him past them. She sat at the table and let the questions sit. 2. "Why do people hate?" he asked once. "Because they are afraid," she said. "Of what?" "Of being small," she said. "But we are all small," he said, opening his hands. "Yes," she said. "And that is the secret. When you accept being small, you make room for a big love." Years later, when Lucas stood on a stage to talk about a project he had started, a network of youth centers where kids could study, play, and eat hot meals after school, he told the crowd that his life had changed the day he chose a mother who had already chosen him. He told them about the red dress and the rainy night, and the way a candle on a table can feel like the sun if the right people sit around it. Edward sat in the front row with his hands folded, older, and stronger in the ways that matter. Grace sat beside him, her eyes shining, her heart quiet and full. When the talk ended, Lucas came down the steps, and the three of them stood together, like pillars of a bridge that had taken years to build. Reporters asked for a quote. Edward smiled at Grace and then at the microphones. "Write this down," he said. "Wealth is loud. Love is steady. Choose steady." And so the mansion that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter, the kind that comes from work, truth, and love. Grace stood at the kitchen window one evening, watching Lucas run across the lawn with his kite dancing in the wind, Edward walking slowly behind him. She smiled, knowing that storms might still come, but this house had roots now deep, steady, and strong. Some people spend their lives chasing gold. She had learned that the richest treasure was a heart that chose you and kept choosing every single day.